Good morning, good day, good evening, whenever you're tuning in. This is Preston Smith with the three things, courtesy of the Corners magazine, coming to you from MRP Studios in the Praga side of Warsaw, Poland. And yes, if you haven't watched the three things before, first of all, my name is Preston Smith. I am your host. I'm a local licensed detective, risk intelligence investigator. Not only here, we look at everything going on in Central Europe. So if you have a problem, get in touch with me. You can find me on www.cddi.pl. You can find the Corners on www.thecorners.pl. And that's enough of an introduction, but back to what do we do? Well, we look at everything from politics to the war in Ukraine to true crime to corruption, etc. And so that's going to be a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. The three things are three things for this evening. It's evening for me anyway. It's a Sunday evening. The first thing, well, yes, the Polish election's coming up on October 15th. These are on the mind of many Europeans. First everyone was worried about the Turkish elections. Now it's the Polish elections. But the Polish elections, yeah, they are a subject that matters, especially since we have a war right next door. And since, to be frank about it, this government hasn't always got along very well with the EU. So there's some rooting, they want Poland to be closer to the EU. Some in Poland don't want to be closer to the EU. We're going to talk about that. Now, the second thing, corruption. And I'm talking about corruption in general. And why? Because kind of an EC, I guess I should say EC, former luminary made a very, if you ask me, controversial statement about corruption in Ukraine. We're going to talk about that, just talk about corruption in general. And you may say, why talk about something in general? Well, in general, you're about to find out. And finally, the third thing, yes, we're going to run through the Ukrainian war update. Now, I'm going to blast through things today because if you can't tell, I got these tiny squinty eyes because I'm a little bit under the weather. It happens. The weather is changing. The fall is coming, it's getting wetter, it's getting colder, which is going to impact a lot of things on the continent, and it's impacting me, to tell you the truth. So let's get on as fast as we can before I fall over unconscious to the first thing. Now, the first thing, the Polish elections. Now, I talked about the Polish elections last week, and very in general terms, and I guess I'm going to be quick and in general again, but I got more questions from readers sending me, all kinds of messages actually about the Polish elections and what do I think is going to happen. Well, to tell you the truth, if I knew exactly what was going to happen, I wouldn't be doing this. I'd be making a lot more money somewhere else. But if we're going to talk about the best indicators of what's going to happen, first of all, let's look at the background very quickly, and then let's look at the most recent polls. Well, the background is that the Law and Justice Party, PiS, which is kind of the strong man behind PiS, the founder, Jarosław Kaczynski, who you could say was he was sort of the co-founder or the co-strongman prior to the death of his brother, former president Lech Kaczynski. Well, Jarosław Kaczynski, he's a force. Okay, he's been a force for a long time. A big chunk of the country is not fond of him, but a bigger chunk of the country has been fond of him. But he's done some things that have kind of irritated the EU and a lot of other people in between. The judicial reform that went on, some claim it's, I'm not going to say some claim, there's been, trying to stack the Supreme Court, major changes in the judicial system. The EU has not been too fond of this. The take on abortion, the take on rights for homosexuals, and etc. These things are, right-wing controversial. On the other side, this is a party that's very socialist. So it's kind of a, from the get-go, you got to look at the Law and Justice Party is maybe not what you would think of in the West when you talk about right or left or whatever, because it's sort of this and that. Some of the controversial social programs, for example, they call it 500 plus, 500 plus, then it became 800 plus. It's like you're giving money to people for having kids. Well, the Republicans out there are not fond of that kind of thing. So you get into kind of a right-wing, more pro-Catholic church, conservative, and then you've got kind of the socialist issues. And, well, in a way, That is peace. And then you have the party that is the biggest challenge for peace right now, which is actually KO, but in the past we called it PO, and I always just keep thinking of it as civic platform because that's just kind of my mindset because I've been here too long. That was a party that reigned, and it looked like they could reign forever. It was very more pro-EU at the time when it was really in power. It was considered very pro-business. This is where you have Donald Tusk, the former prime minister, who's come back, and he's kind of the major challenge for peace. And man, these two parties have been going at it to the point where peace has claimed that Tusk is, basically going to be subservient to Germany, or even worse, to where the other side is say peace just wants Poland just to leave the EU, and some of the accusations on both sides, if you ask me, are exaggerated. Some of them you could say kind of do hit close to home. I'm not going to get too much into that because for a lot of our watchers, you just kind of want to know who is going to win. Well, like I said, it's hard to predict who's going to win. But if we're going to look at the polls, and I will say this though, when you look at the EU, it's pretty clear that the old EU countries, a lot of the parties in the old EU in general, seems to be rooting for Donald Tusk and KO, not PO now. You can say that, but then in each country you've got some parties that are probably going to be more aligned with peace, etc. But whatever. So just think EU kind of more PO. Peace, maybe not so much with the EU. Now that's a very, very much a gross kind of stereotype, and we'll get into why that's kind of not true after we look at the polls. Kind of is true. But let's take a look at the polls. Now this is an Ebers poll which came out actually yesterday. And according to this, we're going to see pretty high frequency of voting, maybe up to 65%. But what is important, the party that's got the most support right now, according to this poll, this is an Ebers poll which was published on ONET. Got to give those guys credit. They probably paid for it. But peace comes out ahead at 34%. Now, this is a little bit down. I think last week I told you that peace was around 36%. To tell you the truth, 34%, when I look at these polls, I'm always a little bit skeptical. Polls, not knocking Ebers, but just polls in general, and when I'm talking about surveys, just surveys like of the electorate in general, have always been a little off. And I tell you why. Historically, it's because the people that are making the calls and trying to do the polling tend to call bigger cities, and they don't tend to hit all these little villages. And in fact, years ago, there was a big problem, if you ask me, because they were calling people on their cell phones, and a lot of people in the little villages, they didn't even have cell phones back then. Now it's all changed. But there still does seem to be a bias, if you ask me, when it comes to cities. So 34%, I think that's going to be too low. I think they're going to come in higher than that. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win, because right now, according to this latest poll, you've got KO. Now, according to this poll, they were coming in around 29%. I have seen another poll. There's a poll that was published by Reuters, which had them at around 30, closer to 30%. Okay, give or take, we kind of know where we are. I would say that the odds are more that peace will gain during the election because of this factor that I just mentioned than will PO. But hey, you don't know. We don't know what the turnout's going to be. A week ago when we had this March of 1 million hearts and you had, like it looked like 1 million people, it was several 100,000, not 800,000 in the Capitol, that kind of thing. Maybe, people think you're going to win, they vote with the winner. So maybe we are going to see a little bit of influence there. But what it's probably going to come down to are the other parties that are in the race, and especially when we get into a party called the Third Way. Now, the Third Way, according to this Ebers poll that I was talking about, they supposedly are around 10.6%. I've talked to people who said they're not sure if they're going to hit that high or not. The problem with the Third Way is that's a coalition of parties. This means they got to hit 8% or else they just don't count in these elections. If they don't count, well, then all bets are off. Possibly if the Third Way doesn't actually make it into Parliament, then peace actually is going to rule. And there's some political analysts who've said if Third Way doesn't get at least 8%, well, hey, that's it. Peace is in there, and they're going to be in there forever, etc. Whatever. That may not necessarily be true either, because there is Lewica, which is 10%. Now, Lewica is probably more likely to go with Platforma if they're going to form a coalition, but that's not even the party that I'm really wondering what's going to happen with. The party that actually is kind of a curiosity is Confederacja. Now, if you want to know what Confederacja is, think of the libertarians. Now, if you're from the United States, I mean, not socialists. They don't like handouts. I don't know. They're hardcore in that fashion, but they also, which I'm not saying libertarians are like this, but the head of Confederacja, young guy. This is actually kind of the funny thing. This guy Sławomir Mencen. Now, what is interesting? This is like the first time that we're basically seeing kind of the TikTok effect that's actually going to hit Poland. I'm trying to check now, but I think he has something like 800,000 or 900,000. Maybe he's got even 1 million. Maybe I don't have it here. TikTok followers. But this is one of the Confederation leaders. Now, this guy in the past has said some things that, I don't know. It's like he had this 5-point program from a few years ago. He doesn't seem to talk about it so much now. He wasn't fond of gays or foreigners or anybody, and it was, that kind of thing. That's a little bit, he seems a little bit less inclined to talk like that now, and I'm not trying to misrepresent you. If you want to come on the show, but not before elections, then happy to interview you. But, he's been on this kind of, sort of almost like this kind of, beer run, very, very smart, when it comes down to, is getting out in the country and get out in the grassroots, have a beer with people, talk to them, get to know them. There is an appeal for younger voters who are just kind of sick of the old gray heads, guys like me. So we don't really know what's going to happen with them. Now, they don't have to they can get 5% and still get in parliament because they're not really a coalition. So I don't see how they're not going to get in. Now, I've seen polls which are saying they're 8-9%. If they get in, what happens? Now, let's just say that Lewica, for now, let's just assume they're getting in, okay? And then we don't really know how peace is going to do. I mean, they don't have to get 33%, they might get 40%. So when we say we're rolling the dice and we don't know what's going to happen in these elections, we don't know. What I kind of think is going to happen, if I were going to place my bets right now, I think we're going to have a situation where you've got, peace has a strong turnout. KO has a strong turnout. Confederacja has an okay turnout and decides not to go into coalition with anybody, right? And what this would mean is we're going to be looking at snap elections. So this election that we're going to have on the 15th may wind up not being, the deciding factor for what Parliament's going to look like, what the Polish government's going to look like in the future. Now, I'll tell you the truth, it could be that peace just wins, that they have a huge turnout, that they wind up, maybe they make a deal with Confederacja later. Confederacja says, okay, look, we do kind of agree with you on some of these subjects, because peace has come out and said, look, they look at immigration and the immigration quotas and the immigrants from the Middle East, Africa, and they want to at least vet that hard or stop it, or whatever. They've been sideswiped with this visa scandal I've talked about for the last couple of shows, but that doesn't really change your stance. Well, hey, Confederacja, they're going to be down with that. So there is some common ground, but then when it comes to the social programs, there's not common ground. Very difficult for me to see that they would join in a real coalition, but you never know. All bets are off, because the thing is, in Poland, and not only in Poland, but in Poland, in being a cynic here, and I'm not saying this just applies to one party or another, just we've seen it again and again, that there's a big draw that you do end up wanting to go into coalition, even with some party that's not the best of bedfellows, because there are these big state companies that offer lots of positions and power and money. Just the way it goes. Now, on the flip side, could you see Confederacja maybe go into coalition with KO, with Donald Tusk and them? Maybe. I mean, this is really kind of a wild card here. But if you ask me, I think that we're going to see kind of a hung jury and eventual snap elections, and then we'll kind of be more getting down to it. So I kind of think that this election on the 15th is going to be somewhat anticlimactic. Doesn't matter. Yes, it doesn't. It does matter. It doesn't matter. Yes, it does matter. It does matter because, again, we've got a war on right next door for quite a long time. The current government were huge supporters of Ukraine, really pushing on the other countries in the West, especially hitting on Germany, saying you've got to do your part, supply those tanks, etc. And then now we have the grain issue. That relationship is soured some. So whatever happens after, it may be that after this election, this government calms down a little bit, but they're making some promises, or at least playing that part, that they're going to be a hard line on this when it comes to the grain deal. And again, the relationship with Ukraine has soured somewhat. But at any rate, what happens afterwards? Does Poland become closer to the EU, closer to Germany? Does it go further away? What's the support for Ukraine look like? These are key elections, but I think that, like I said, maybe they might be anticlimactic. But that's all I'm going to say, because I don't want to be accused of pushing one party or the other. Just get out and vote if you're in Poland. Vote with your heart and with your brain, and may the best party win. Now let's get on to the second thing. Now, for the second thing, corruption. Now you're going to say, Preston, what are you talking about corruption? You always talk about corruption. What do you mean this is the second thing? Half your shows, your magazine, everything's corruption. Well, corruption in general in the EU. Now, the reason why I am bringing this up is because this week, the former European Commissioner basically just, at really not a great time, nagged on Ukraine and said, no way should it get into the EU, should it be an EU candidate, because it is totally corrupt. Ukraine is totally corrupt. Now, Claude-Juncker, that's what he said. Now, some of you may wonder who this guy is. He's the former head of the European Commission. He was the prime minister of that bastion of transparency, Luxembourg. Some of you, if you get on YouTube, actually, there's a really kind of a great video where he's called the Happy Slapper. I think the Telegraph put that on, where he every time he meets somebody, he slaps them to say hello. Kind of a strange thing, but anyway, it makes me laugh. You should go find the video. But let's talk about this. Let's talk about corruption in general. And when I saw this, to be honest, it really pissed me off. Now, caveat. I am not absolutely naive. I'm not going to sit there and say, no, there's never been corruption in Ukraine. Look, I function as a risk intelligence investigator. I've known the region forever. Yeah, when clients want to go to Ukraine in the past, especially in the past, we'd say, okay, look, you got to watch it. There's a lot you need to know. You need to know what's going on politically. You need to know who is there locally. You need to know, is there maybe an oligarch involved or a clan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to say that there were not issues with corruption in Ukraine. And to tell you the truth, in a way, yeah, he's not the only one to be worried about that. There are reports that came out, I believe it was Poltico, but it may have been others that came out, that the U.S., that there's a leaked document, that the Biden administration was extremely worried about corruption in Ukraine, and they don't want to get caught out when they're fighting to send aid to Ukraine at a time when there's so much resistance from especially one part of the Republican Party, and you had this huge blow up in Congress that saw the speaker kicked out, etc. And a lot of this is over aid to Ukraine. So you don't want to be caught out when it comes to corruption. At the same time, when we talk about, there's sometimes when you wonder who's doing the talking and why. Because let's just take a quick look at Juncker, and let's talk about corruption. He came out and he basically, I'm going to quote this article. This is from Poltico, and he said, anyone who has had anything to do with Ukraine knows that this is a country that is corrupt at all levels of society. Despite its efforts, it is not ready for accession. It needs massive internal reform processes. And he said, I am very angry about some voices in Europe who are telling Ukrainians they become members immediately. Okay, well, he's really angry. All right. let's put this into perspective here. Yes, do I think that Ukraine would have some work to do to join the EU? Yeah. However, are these guys basically dying on the front, fighting for basically Western European ideals? Well, I would say, yeah, they are. It's hard to argue that they're not, since they certainly don't want to become a satellite of Russia. But let's go just a little bit further and talk about, well, just who is doing the talking, okay? Who's doing the talking and what this represents? Well, before we actually talk about just Juncker himself and who he is, or maybe we should do that. Let's do that first. Let's just look at his background. Not saying he's a bad guy, but okay, he was the Prime Minister of Luxembourg. Again, bastion of transparency, it is not. You know how many times, and I'm not going to be the only one that's going to say this, if you talk to other risk intelligence investigators in the region, or detectives or whatever, you'll be looking at a company that's got some problems. Maybe there's a manager that somehow money's shooting off to the side, whatever, and then you hit these offshore companies. You know how many times you hit Luxembourg? Well, let me tell you, it's not something that never happens. I'll just put it to you that way. Second of all, if you take a look at just, Luxembourg in general and Jean-Claude in general, here's a little bit of the background. He served as the president of the European Commission from 2014 to 2019. This is all from Wikipedia. It's not me, so don't get mad at me. You can go get mad at Wikipedia. However, right before he started serving as head of the European Commission, a story on, this was in November 2012. This is on RTL Letzburg, not that I can pronounce anything in that language, but anyway. They aired a story alleging that the former head of state intelligence, Marco Meal, had used a special wristwatch to actually record a secret, a confidential anyway, conversation with Juncker, right? You're like, oh man, he should be upset about that. However, once he found out about the recording, he didn't do anything about it. In fact, he allowed him to leave the Secret Services early to join a position with Siemens. And I'm not going to say anything there. But then there were also, it turns out that in December 2012, the Chamber of Deputies in Luxembourg voted to set up an inquiry into the allegations that basically the Luxembourg Secret Service was bugging politicians. They were buying cars for private use. They were taking payments in exchange for access to officials. They claimed that there were 6 or 7 illegal wiretapping operations from 2000 to 2009. And the report included that Juncker should bear political responsibility for the activities of the SREL. Now, he said he denied that he should be taking responsibility, that there was any wrongdoing there, etc. Okay, well then there was a 7-hour debate, and in the end, there was a lack of confidence. The president of the LSAP, the chair of the parliamentary inquiry into the SREL, declared his lack of confidence in Juncker, and then you ended up having, they basically said we have to have new elections. Okay, Juncker was succeeded on December 4th, December 2013. I mean, on the 4th of December 2013. So basically what happened is he was mixed up in this alleged bugging, tapping, and, you got the Secret Service running around sorting out cars for themselves. He said he didn't have any responsibility for that, but I don't know. Then early 2014, this is also Wikipedia. Just after he becomes head of the commission, it turns out that there was a document that came out in what was called LuxLeaks. Now, you've heard of like the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers. There was a whole series of these leaks and the WikiLeaks, etc. But anyway, with the aid of the Luxembourg government, companies transferred tax liability for many billions of euros to Luxembourg, where the income was taxed at a fraction of 1%. 1%. Now, the European Parliament was brought against, a motion of censure in the European Parliament was brought against Juncker over his role in the tax avoidance schemes, but the motion was defeated. Okay, the motion was defeated. You're innocent until proven guilty. Now, during his tenure, Juncker also oversaw the 2014 of the Luxembourg Freeport, which this is also Wikipedia, which former German member of European Parliament Wolf Klintz dubbed fertile ground for money laundering and tax evasion. In March 2015, now this is where it gets odd. In March 2015, Juncker called for the formation of a European army because a common army among the Europeans would convey to Russia that we are serious about defending the values of the European Union. And then we'll come back to that. And then in January 2017, leaked diplomatic cables showed that Juncker, as Luxembourg's prime minister from 1995 till the end of 2013, blocked EU efforts to fight tax avoidance by multinational corporations. Luxembourg agreed to multinational businesses and individual demand, this rate of less than 1%. This is the guy that's actually lecturing Ukraine on corruption, right? Now, okay, I'm not saying he's corrupt. I'm just saying that, look, you're not going to tax any of the big corporations. You got the Secret Service thing going on there. You're the guy that's actually coming out and saying this. Why is it important? First of all, I don't know who asked him for his opinion on this. Why is it important? Well, it's coming at a time which falls, to tell you the truth, right into Russian interests, because Russia is basically prolonging this war, hoping that the West will get tired of sending money to Ukraine, and hoping that even Ukrainians will stop believing in what the Ukrainian government is doing in fighting this war, and hoping that the U.S. government and Congress, that all the support from the war is going to fall apart there and the money is going to fall apart there. This is a very bad time to come out and start lecturing. And also, we're going to go back to what? The former president of the Ukraine, Yanukovych, who had basically that palace with like gold taps and his own private zoo and all that. I mean, this is one of the reasons why there was, a revolution in Ukraine, was because they were sick of that stuff. I don't get it. Tell you the truth, I don't get it. But let's take one more quick look at this, and let's take a look at a list. Now, some of you may not know what the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is. Basically, the United States passed a law years and years ago called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and it's kind of the long arm of the law of the U.S., saying if we see you're corrupt and there's any way we can tie it to U.S. interests at all, and they're pretty creative when it comes to that, we're going to fine you crazy money. Now, that's a whole nother subject, and how they manage to do that, and should they be able to do that, and is it just massive U.S. overreach? And there have been fewer FCPA cases recently, but and the fines are crazy. But, it is indicative, because when it comes to actual governments fighting and willing to punish companies, including their own citizens, for corruption, well, I don't know. I think that the U.S. is definitely the most aggressive. So let's take a look. And this is an interesting list. This was by the FCPA blog, which is a really good blog. And they made a list of the biggest FCPA cases for each year for the past 10 years. This is going up to 2022, okay? 2022, the biggest FCPA fine, Glencore, Switzerland. 2021, Deutsche Bank, 122.9 million in fines. Deutsche Bank. 2020, Goldman Sachs Group, they paid 3.3 billion in fines. 2019, Telefonaktiebolaget, LM Ericsson, Sweden, sorry, I can't pronounce Swedish, 1.06 billion. This is actually from the FCPA blog. This is not from me. Then 2018, Petróleo Brasileiro, Petrobras, Brazil, 1.78 billion. 2017, Telia Company, AB Sweden, 1.01 billion. 2016, Vimpocom Limited, Netherlands, 795 million. 2015, BHP Billiton, Australia, 25 million. 2014, Alstom SA France, 772 million. 2013, Total SA France, 398 million. Wow, man, check it out. Gosh, that's a lot. I mean, we're talking Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, France. That's a lot of European countries on there. And when it comes to new European members, who he criticized, he said they're not ready, I don't see any of them on there. I don't see Poland on there. I don't see the Czech Republic on there. I don't see Slovakia. Now, I'm not saying there's not corruption in these countries. Believe me, there's plenty of problems. There's been plenty of corruption scandals in Poland. There's been plenty in Czech Republic, in Slovakia, in Bulgaria, in Romania. We can go through them, just like there's been a ton of them in, what are you talking about? Italy. There's never been corruption scandals there. Come on, that's a lot of, let's not be the pot calling the kettle black here. And yeah, I do think that there are problems in Ukraine. Even the Ukrainian government has come out and said, we don't like what's going on with the draft. They got rid of, they had some issues with some of their, tenders, etc. Yeah, do I think that there's an issue there? There is an issue there. Of course there's an issue there. The funny thing is right now, with the U.S. sending money, and the U.S. all over everything that's going there, so many nonprofits all over everything that's going there. You've got the EU focused on it. Everyone knows how much there is to lose. Not saying that there's not theft, not saying that nothing's going sideways, but now's not the time. And to quote a French politician that I was not a fan of either, maybe somebody missed a good time just to shut up. Now let's go on to the third thing. Now, the third thing, Ukrainian war report. Look, I can't say that there's a lot of good news in this one. It's a bit of a follow-up from last week. Last week, I told you I gave you 9 reasons why I was worried about what is going on. One of the biggest things that is going on right now, it looks like I'm not sure if I want to call it an offensive, but the Russians are getting very, very active. But before we get into that, let's talk about very quickly what's going on in Israel. Now, I'm not going to get in, I think the whole world knows what's going on in Israel with Hamas and the missiles and the civilians that are being killed and everything. And the only reason I'm pointing this out is just from a kind of a geopolitical point of view. And I'm not saying it's the truth. I'm just saying that if you just type in Hamas, Israel, Russia, you will see a lot of articles that are implying that Russia is somehow behind this conflict. Now, I'm one of those, okay, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, smells like a duck, it's probably a duck, but I'm not the only one wondering this. Whole host, you've got, this is an Arab, a headline from Al Arabiya. Russia wants to use Israel-Hamas conflict, blah, blah, blah. Russia's behind Hamas attacks in Israel. This is an expert for TVP World. ISW, Russia exploiting Hamas attack on Israel to divert. This is Yahoo News. Former Russian, that's also The Hill. The former Russian president says Hamas attacks come as an expected development. Hands that pushed Hamas attack forward are in Moscow. This is Ynet News, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of these. Now, why are people jumping to this conclusion? And I will say jumping to this conclusion because I don't think anybody has any information that would prove this yet. But there was the massive use of rockets. Okay, well, you've got Iran. You've had Iran supplying drones to Russia, which leads to the next point, that you not only just kind of the rockets sort of shot in the general direction, they land where they may, but you've got drones that are being used. I've seen footage of tanks, Israeli tanks taken out. This seems to be much, much, much better planned. And also the whole infiltration, how Hamas was doing this, etc. Like I said, looks like a duck, walks like a duck, smells like a duck. We don't know yet if it is a duck. But if Evgeny Prigozhin was still alive with Wagner, I think that would be the next thing people would say. Was Wagner involved? So let's just keep that in mind. The other thing that does make you wonder are the attacks, the intentional attacks on civilians, which kind of does remind us of what happened in the first days of the war outside of Kiev, where you had these massacres in Bucha, et cetera, et cetera. So whatever the case is, this does fall into kind of, Russians' wider strategic hopes, let's just put it that way, in the sense that, we've already seen Israel reach out to the Biden administration. The Biden administration is promising they're going to support Israel. That's money. That's allocating more resources to another hotspot. We have a lot of hotspots. We talked about the Balkans last week with what's going on, the Serbia, Kosovo, almost going to the edge of war, coming back down, the worries there. Well, this is a hotter hot spot, and it means money. This also takes us back to what I mentioned before at the beginning of the program we went into a week ago, this big battle in Congress that saw the ouster of the Speaker of the House, the blow up among the Republicans themselves. A lot of this is over money, or at least some of this is over money going to Ukraine. And right now, President Joe Biden is talking about a one and done kind of way to bypass this situation in Congress and send $100 billion to Ukraine. And I don't know what to think about that. That doesn't seem like it's going to make anyone happy. Maybe it's a strategy to scare the Republicans or scare Congress into thinking, man, we've got to come to some sort of agreement to get the aid moving so we don't see something pulled on us, which is this commitment for some. I'm not sure. I don't even know what to think about that. That headline caught me off guard. What this does mean, though, it's obviously not good news for Ukraine when it comes to future supplies of weapons and what's going to happen next. Now, I don't want to be too much on a down note, because we have seen the Ukrainians pull up, their missile attacks, drone attacks, sea drone attacks of everything, and basically convinced the Russian Navy that it's not safe, apparently, patrolling anywhere near the shores of Ukraine, and they're pulling back. So there are some of these things that are happening. But when we get into what's happening on the ground and the supply of weapons and the fact that we're into October, the weather is changing, etc., it's looking more and more like it's going to be a tough go, and which brings us to what is happening on the ground. So let's turn to the maps. And let's go through those very, very quickly. Now, if you take a look at this first map, and I'm going to go actually from the north to the south. So just to get yourself kind of oriented again, you've got the first map, and you see, again, this kind of crescent. So down at the bottom, where you've got the Black Sea, and down the way you've got Kherson. You go further to the east, that's Zaporizhzhia. You go up, that's going to be going up through Staromaevsky, Bakhmut, all the way up to Kupiansk, and then still further, you got Sumy, but we're not going to talk about that. There's nothing actually happening there right now. But so that's the overall map. Now let's go from the north to the south. The reason why I want to start in the north, we're going to start in Kupiansk. Now, the last couple of weeks I've implied, and I still think I'm right, that the Russians, they stalled at Kupiansk. They were not making a lot of progress. Now, if we go back a couple of weeks, we talked about this big buildup. We talked about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky worried about putting too many troops down in Zaporizhzhia to force a breakthrough there, because he said that there's a 200,000 troop buildup, et cetera, et cetera. It turned out, though, that the pressure that Ukrainians were putting on the Russians down in the south probably did divert some of their best offensive troops and airborne troops down to that area. So it probably did take a bit out of the Kupiansk front. But there is something that happened, and this headline maybe got lost or people kind of forgot about it. It's that, and this was only a week or two ago, and actually, let me see, I'll see if I can tell you the exact date. Maybe I can't tell you the exact date, but I'll put a link to it, that Putin basically called his defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, on the carpet and said, you've got to stop this Ukrainian counteroffensive by early October, okay? And that was a deadline. So I guess this was basically a month ago when he said this. Maybe time keeps on slipping into the future, and it's hard for me to keep up with. But when he called Shoigu on the carpet, and he said, you've got basically until early October to stop this counteroffensive, this kind of was indicative of maybe what's going to come, which in a weird way gives me hope that this offensive, and I'm going to go through these different movements, is not really an offensive. It's sort of Shoigu pulling out all the stops to basically make sure the Ukrainians do not get anywhere, but especially down in Zaporizhzhia. Because what we're seeing now are the Russians really pulling out all the stops, or trying to, in that Kupiansk front. I don't mean just Kupiansk, because if you look at this bigger map of Kupiansk and you go all the way down, you see all these arrows going all the way down, down the page. Those are different, basically kind of mini Russian counteroffensives. And I say mini because we're not talking about suddenly, 10,000 troops rushing across the border. We're talking about neither side can actually advance like that, to tell you the truth. But we are talking about pressure being put on the Ukrainians. And if you take a look at this next map, you see Kupiansk, and again, we're going to go back to Liman Pershi. This is from Deep State UA, and you see going straight down towards Zinkivka, you've got the Russians pushing there. We've heard reports in the past again and again that the Russian troops they've thrown into that are not especially well trained or skilled, and the Ukrainians keep holding them off at Zinkivka, and they're not actually getting anywhere. There, as you can see, I don't know if you can see on the map here, but right straight to the east of Kupiansk, you've got Orlyanka. There's a push there, and we've also got, if you go further down towards the Svatovo front, kind of in the direction from Svatovo towards Borova. We've talked about that many times in the past. We're not seeing that the Ukrainians are breaking there, or that the Russians are making a lot of progress. But it almost seems like the call went out from Shoigu that said, everybody man up and start attacking, because we've got to put as much pressure on the Ukrainians everywhere at once, as much as we can. If you go a little bit further south, same story at Novohorivka, same story at Makhivka. Makhivka is down when you see the 3rd Motor Rifle Division, the Russian 3rd Motor Rifle Division. Again, a lot of pressure on Makhivka. That actually is a little bit of a worry, because some of the reports that I've heard and a couple of friends I've talked to said, yeah, that the Russians are really trying there. It's not just like kind of these kind of mini, let's have some firefights for a couple of days, and no, this looks like maybe it's a little bit more intense. But I'm not hearing anywhere that it looks as if there's going to be a breakthrough. We go further south to Lyshansk and to Bilohorivka. That's actually not that new. The Russians have been putting on pressure there. That apparently has been ramped up. But again, it looks as if everywhere that we see that the Ukrainians are holding the line. Again, if we take a closer look, though, at Bilohorivka, and you see Debrova, you see it's the Storm Z troops, the Shogis, the Storm Z troops are pushing there. You've got another push down at Zolotarivka. I'm not hearing that there is the Ukraine is going to break, but it just seems like there's being pressure put everywhere. Now, let's go down to Bakhmut. And north of Bakhmut, we know the Russians have been attacking. That's been going back and forth. The funny thing is, the Russians report the Ukrainians are attacking. The Ukrainians report the Russians are attacking. But we've talked again and again about Klishivka and Andriivka. There was optimism at one point that the Ukrainians could make a major breakthrough at Klishivka. And if we go to the next map, which we see as a satellite map, you can barely make out, maybe you can make out this railroad line that the Ukrainians were trying to break past. As far as I understand it, they have not managed to. And that the Russians have been counterattacking hard there. There was a point last week when we were hearing that they were both north and south, that the Russians were also pushing hard at Andriivka. But it looks like everyone has stalled out there. Maybe this next map shows you a little bit of a closer view of Klishivka. Now, if we drop down further, you've seen the same thing at the Avdiivka front. Same thing the Russians pushing at Staromykhailivka. At Marinka, there have been intense fights and battles by the Russians. Now we've heard that the Russians have lost quite a bit of equipment there, tanks, heavy equipment, vehicles. This is kind of indicative that the Russians are actually throwing everything. When you see these mechanized divisions try to roll forward, despite the fact that they're going to get droned and blown up, and then you see wreckage everywhere, which is what we're hearing anyway, then that actually does kind of qualifies that they've made some sort of more intense push than, let's just say, trying to up activity on the line. Again, not much to be gained there. If we go down to Staromayorsky, now if you see this map, you've got Staromayorsky, and then you've got Novodonetsk, and then further, kind of almost off the map, if you go further to the east, you got Vuhledar. We know there's been intense fighting at Vuhledar. I do not know what the status there is, but if we go back to Staromayorsky, where there was a little bit of a hope, remember that they were going to break through, take Zavitny Bajani straight to the south of Staromayorsky, but also Staromayorsky is where we had, yes, if we jump forward a couple of maps, we've got Zavitny Bajani, but then we've also got Urazaini. Now, the Russians are apparently really trying to take back Urazaini. There was a time when it looked like the Ukrainians were just actually going to romp there, break through. They're going to also move into Zavitny Bajani, but the Urazaini seemed to be a major breakthrough. That seems to have stalled out, and the Russians are pushing back, trying to take back ground. An interesting point that's been made by a number of war bloggers is that the Ukrainians hold ground once they take it, but the Russians are quite willing to drop back and then counterattack, which kind of goes back to their entire war doctrine. If you go back to, if you read about the history of, let's say, the Second World War, they kind of, because they have so many people, they do have a war machine. They can ramp up. They can turn their economy into a war machine, which is kind of risky, but it looks like that's what Putin is going to do. They can afford to do that, to trade land for time and then fight back. And it does seem as if they're just following through on this strategy. But if we go now to Robotnia, here is where it looks as if this may end up being the key indicator as to whether or not this Ukrainian counteroffensive of the late spring through the summer is going to be gauged as success. Now, we know that the Ukrainians have gained land. We talked last week that maybe in the big picture, Russia gained a little more in 2023 than did the Ukrainians. But there's been a lot of talk ever since of what's happening in Zaporizhzhia and Robotnia, and if they can make this drive on Tokmak, which you can see down at the bottom of the page. If you actually take a glance back, I'm going to actually go back and show you Staromayorsky. There are two things that are worrying me about both locations. One is if the Ukrainians manage to jump back to break through Staromayorsky, you see this whole line of trenches and fortifications further south, so down around Orlinsky, Herorivka, Yelinsky, Novopetrikivka, Stempne. We've heard again and again that the Russians are pumping in troops basically into the entire southern front. So that if there is a breakthrough, then it'll get stopped later on. I mean, that is actually a very intimidating factor, considering how difficult it has been for the Ukrainians to demine, break through the first line, get through more mines, try to make gains, and they have made some gains. But then you see that again, the Russians trading land for time and just throwing in troops. Very worrying. Now, if we go to Robotnia, we were seeing the Ukrainians do some smart things here. One, we know they're attacking Kopani. I mentioned that last week that they're probably going to do that. It looks like they are doing that. They're trying to widen this kind of salient that they've got when it comes to Robotnia, drive down to Novoprokopivka. We still have not seen them make any gains there. Unfortunately, there was this hope that they would hit Verbove and maybe get through and around the edge of these trench lines and drive down towards Tokmak and maybe eventually take Verbove. It appears that that is not moving too fast. Now you can see that there are a lot of trench lines that go, and that Tokmak, which is way down in the southwest, is also fortified, and we're hearing that it's becoming more and more fortified. But if we go, it'll be easiest to see if we go to this satellite map, and you see where this 11th Squad bars is. The only reason I highlighted that is because this shows Verbove, and this is like going straight in that direction was one of the early one of the early Ukrainian drives, and they took a little bit of Verbovy, and it seemed like they were going to make somewhere. Well, it looks like the Russians are pushing straight back at them about where that 11th Squad Bars is, and further to the northwest. And so this looks like that may have stalled out or slowed down. There's nothing really to report. In Kherson, I usually show you around Kozachi Laheri and the islands, etc. But what we're seeing is, I think that we're kind of seeing maybe not the end of the counteroffensive, and I'm not going to sit here and say the counteroffensive was a failure, but I'm saying that time is running out, and again, the Russians are trading time for land and just chance to bolster troops in the hopes that between what's happening in U.S. Congress, what's happening in the West, in the EU, you know, between say Poland and the West, Poland and Ukraine, you know, guys like, as we said, Juncker coming out and saying, you know, taking away some of the upside for the Ukrainians in the long term, saying they're not ready to join the EU. But then we've got the conflict in Israel. I'm afraid it's going to come down to money. I'm worried it's going to come down to money and a commitment in the West to keep fighting this war and supporting the Ukrainians. This may just be a reality that the Ukrainians have to face. Now, I don't want to be defeatist. I'm just calling it as I see it right now. And everything could change. You know, after the next elections in Poland, October 15th, we may, you know, once things are stabilized here, if they are stabilized, we may see yet another dynamic. Now, that's all I've got today for the three things. I hope that's a little bit to think about. You may agree with me, you may disagree with me. Feel free to write in comments. You can send in letters to query@cddi.pl or to the Corners Mag at gmail.com. Otherwise, it's over and out. See you soon, but not if I see you first. And bye-bye.